So today I want to take you on a journey into the future of global rights and justice. After all, this session is scheduled as the launch of the FORGE, the Future of Human Rights and Global Governance program. And FORGE, as Ariel said, is meant to be a place for collaboration, for thinking and imagining the future of these fields. And this is why we convene thinkers and doers from around the world, like everyone sitting here in this room. But here's the catch. We human beings are pretty bad at forecasting. We're pretty bad at imagining the future. So you might say, well, I may be bad at forecasting the future lives of other people or even of society. But surely I know myself. And I can pretty much anticipate what I will be like 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So I would invite you all to engage in a short exercise, painless exercise. It'll be very short, I promise. So for those of you who feel comfortable closing your eyes, if you could do that, it's going to last 30 seconds or so. I know that for some folks, including myself, before I started meditating, that was unbearable. But the idea here is start with imagining what you will be like 10 years from now. Your preferences, your values, your personality. Now, let's travel back in time. Try to remember what you were like 10 years ago, year 2013. Your personality, your values, your preferences. So you can open your eyes now, unless you want to keep them closed, and that gives you greater focus. Although I'm going to be using quite a few slides, so that might not work for this particular session. But if you're like most humans, you will have concluded that you changed quite a lot in the last 10 years. But you will not, but also that you will not change all that much in the next 10 years. And actually, you're in very good company. A fantastic, fascinating study by Harvard psychologist Dan Gilbert showed that human beings that have this cognitive bias. They interviewed over 19,000 individuals, ages 18 to 68. And this is what they concluded. So young people, middle-aged people, and older people all believed that they have changed a lot in the past, but would change relatively little in the future. Right? So what's striking really is that we underestimate how much will change despite knowing that we've changed a lot in the past. There's the asymmetry. So future thinking experts have shown that this is a pervasive bias in human cognition. We get stuck in the present. This is what I call, and many others call, presentism. Thinking that the present is some sort of watershed moment in which we and our world have finally become what they will be for the rest of our lives. So as we look towards the future, it may be a good idea to get unstuck from presentism and from the past. And one way to do this, which again, future thinking experts have come up with, is a simple tool called looking back to look forward, which is the framing of the program for this year. So what I propose for the rest of this short talk is that we go back into the history of human rights movement, into the history of the human rights movement, in order to get unstuck and be more imaginative and bold in thinking about the future. And this is actually a very good moment to do this exercise. This year, 2023, is a year of multiple anniversaries in the human rights movement. It's a year of multiple commemorations. I prefer the word commemoration to anniversary because etymologically it means to remember together, to be mindful of together. So as we go through a particularly complex moment in history, both for the planet and for humanity, I would invite us all to be mindful of this moment and also to be mindful of what's happened before us, before our time, both in terms of the achievements and the suffering that's preceded us. And I want to start with the year 1948, for obvious reasons, I think for human rights practitioners and scholars. That was the year when the UN Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the San Francisco Conference. This is an image from the San Francisco Conference. What's less well known, especially in global north circles, is that the UN Human Rights Convention was preceded by more than 6 months by the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Men that was signed in Bogota. And that many of the Latin American states that were instrumental in drafting the American, as in Americas, as opposed to US Declaration of Human Rights and Duties, went on to be instrumental to the drafting of the UN Declaration. Also because by then, Latin American states made up a big chunk of sovereign states before decolonization in Africa and other regions. So with that realization, let's move forward quickly. 1973. I'm making these little pauses to see if you internally can close your eyes if that helps you. You don't have to close your eyes if that is unhelpful. But 1973, of course, has a special meaning for many people in the human rights movement, because that was the year when General Augusto Pinochet violently staged this coup against a democratic elected government in Chile, Salvador Allende's government. And the reaction to that coup and the whole set of strategies and coalitions and transnational advocacy networks that emerged in reaction to dictatorship in not only Chile, but also Argentina, the southern cone countries, and other places, basically pioneered many of the tools that we continue to use. Naming and shaming dictators into compliance with human rights law, for instance. Fast forward to 1993, 30 years ago. That's the first time that someone famously declared that history had ended. Right? But you'll see, there's a pattern here. But the ending here was supposed to be the victory of the West, neoliberal economics, liberal democracy, and a narrow understanding of human rights. Fast forward to 2013, and this is where I want to stay. 10 years ago, because this is where I invited you to imagine or remember what you were like 10 years ago. And then we'll go 10 years into the future. So 2013 was a moment, of course, of many changes, and I'm going to highlight only a few. But I want to begin by recognizing how much has been achieved in the human rights field since 2013, because the tone of especially the academic conversation, especially in this country and the global north, is so pessimistic and one-sided that I feel compelled to begin with a less skewed view of what's happening in the human rights field. And since 2013, well, the youth climate movement emerged as a powerful force that uses very directly, very explicitly, the human rights framework. So you have young individuals, young activists with new tactics and strategies using an older language and refashioning it, and renewing it, refreshing it, because human rights continues to evolve. At the same time, we saw Black Lives Matter in this country, the expansion of marriage equality, the consolidation of the Indigenous rights movement, and so on and so forth. Of course, I'm leaving out many of the key developments because of time constraints here. But a lot has been achieved in the last 10 years. At the same time, it's been a pretty difficult decade. So we went from techno-optimism to techno-pessimism. Try to remember what you used to think about social networks, social media 10 years ago. And then, importantly, in academia, because Forge engages both with ideas and with practices, and this is, I'm going to go through this bit very quickly, but also to note that there have been, of course, worrying trends. 10 years ago, this is an image from the inauguration of President Obama, second term, so 2013. And at the same time, we began to hear rumbles of a new model, so to speak, that President Viktor Orban from Hungary famously or infamously called in 2014 illiberal democracy. So a mix of elections and the systematic and methodic taking apart of the human rights architecture and of democratic guarantees and the rule of law. Sadly, that trend has stuck and spread to other countries. From India, where Narendra Modi was elected in 2014 and has engaged in an equally systematic attempt at developing their own brand of illiberal democracy, and the largest democracy in the world, to, because this is not a privilege of the right, also from the left, Nicolas Maduro was elected in 2013. And just to stay with the elected authoritarians that came to power around that time, of course, I could go on and on, but I don't have time to put all the strong men here. Believe me, I've been updating this slide, but I gave up. So I'm going to stay only with those who continue to be in power, right? 10 years, because this tells you the story of the resilience of this trend. Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. Of course, just to stay with this for a second, this is not only confined to the global south. The elected authoritarianism has also had a strong influence in the US, in the UK, in Europe, in Australia. And that's one of the key challenges that we face today in democratic governance and human rights thinking and advocacy. Let's skip this. But 1993 was, but 2013 was also the year when this book was published, The End Times of Human Rights, which became quite famous mostly because of its title, to be fair to Stephen Hopgood, right? Hopgood is seen as the person who announced the end of human rights, and that who, for those who don't particularly like his work, is seen as kind of the person to criticize, and criticism has gone on for 10 years of his book. To be fair to him, he was more subtle than that. He left space for different forms of, he basically gestured gently towards the end of the book in the direction of a more promising, less top-down form of practicing human rights. But of course, when you use provocative book titles, you get stuck with the title, and then everyone else picks up on that piece. And what happens since is that less careful scholars have joined the chorus and have led to what I would call kind of a whole trend in human rights scholarship that's especially visible. For those of you who come from the global south here in the room, like myself, this may have come as a surprise. It did come as a surprise to me when I first read Stephen Hopgood's book and engaged in what back then was a heated debate in open global rights with Hopgood and with Erin Iyer. We exchanged views on the end times rhetoric, had very different views, each of us. But then I thought that this would last for a couple of years, and then we'd move on. But then 10 years on, I still see a lot of kind of work being produced in academia that continues to engage with this type of framework. So partly what I want to propose here is that this is something that happens often in human history, and this goes back to the Gilbert et al.'s paper, which is actually, I hadn't revealed the title of that paper that I quoted, that interviewed 19,000 people about their preferences and how they will change or not change in the future. The paper is titled The End of History Illusion. And they end with this beautiful quote. This is the very last quote in the paper. So, both teenagers and grandparents seem to believe that the pace of personal change has slowed to a crawl, and that they have recently become the people they will remain. History, it seems, is always ending today. So this is what I would call endism. It's a whole trend. It's a mindset. Endism. So what Forge is suggesting, and what I would invite you all to consider today in the next few days, is that we proclaim the end of endism. 10 years is enough. A lot of our time has been taken up, so much ink, so much, or bits, this is such an anachronic metaphor, but so much space has been taken by this debate. And there are good empirical reasons, academic and practical reasons, to engage in this exercise of considering what comes after endism. Recently, and we're fortunate to have the authors of this recent paper in the Medical Political Science Review with us in this conference, Chris Ferris and Geoff Dancy, who recently published a systematic quantitative review of Google searches. They said, well, let's look at how, like the average person around the world searches for the term human rights in Google. And as you know, Google tends to tell the truth because that's what people use for searching for contents at 2 a.m. in the morning, as opposed to when they get a call from a survey company. And it turns out, I don't want everyone to surprise the bottom line, I just want to give you the bottom line. The idea here and the conclusion of this study is that contrary to many positions in the end times rhetoric or framework, human rights as a term, as a language, continues to can be quite popular. And that is, it sits, for example, at the same level as pandemics, right, in the last few years, which I would say is pretty remarkable. Mm-hmm. And that, interestingly, contrary to the position of some of the authors in the end times framework, it's not the global north citizens, the inhabitants of the global north, that most look for human rights contents, but it's people in the global south, especially in those countries that are going through human rights crisis. So it's people who need human rights most who actively look at least for the language of human rights. You may have, and there have been responses to this paper, but I think it is a fantastic contribution, also because the end times rhetoric was based on very, very limited empirical research. It was kind of an overgeneralization of what human rights looks like from the ivory tower, especially in places like New York, London, or Geneva, as opposed to the rest of the world. And also, more recently, the Open Society Foundations published the Open Society Barometer, which shows that respondents in many countries, in most countries, continue to see the relevance of human rights values. And interestingly, and worryingly, the countries below the average are mostly located in the global north, meaning those where human rights values resonate the least. And then countries in the global, this is the top tier, in the global south, respondents tend to say that they see continued value in human rights. So this is more practically, and this will end. I want to end this talk by briefly sketching what we're trying to contribute to this conversation out of the Forge initiative here at NYU Law. In terms of practice, what the end of endism may produce is just free up space for conversations about responses and solutions. And this is why Forge is set up in a way that looks at the movement and the field as an ecosystem. The field is too rich and diverse. There are so many different campaigns, organizations, collectives, community projects, research centers, action research hubs, innovation hubs that are renewing the language. I mentioned the youth climate movement as one particularly prominent example, but there are many more. They're renewing the language and the promise of human rights. So what we try to do is curate a conversation among very different actors from around the world. And you'll see that represented in the keynotes in this conference. So not staying with the conventional human rights actors. Also, we want to be intentional in focusing on solutions. Not because we think that problems should not be addressed and they continue to be the strength of the human rights movement, and there's a good reason for that. There's no scarcity, there's no dearth of problems in the world that need to be documented in terms of human rights legal tools and also moral language. But because that's the overwhelming focus of the field, we want to propose to carve out some space for discussions about solutions and reactions. So we're taking a page from journalism, which has also traditionally focused on documenting problems as opposed to solutions. And some of you may know about the Solutions Journalism Network, which is an explicit effort on the part of a community of journalists around the world to make sure that they also cover and publish articles and reports on promising solutions to pressing problems from climate change to technological disruption to geopolitical disorder and so on. Importantly, I already said this, we try to curate a conversation that goes back and forth between ideas and practices. We do action research and bring together thinkers and doers, and people who are hybrid types. Importantly, and with this I'll end, as Ariel said, this is not just a conference. I mean, I wish it was just a conference because, quite frankly, it's been quite exhausting to organize it, but it isn't. It turns out that it isn't. It's a long-term effort, but we would not have gotten into the business of running Forge if it was just an event. As exciting as this event is, as wonderful as it is to see you all. But we mean to contribute, at least in a small way, to actually seeing those solutions go forward in an experimental spirit. So some solutions will fail, some others will succeed. Some solutions that fail today will plant the seeds for future successes. So we're in this for the long term, for the long game. And finally, we're offering to serve as incubators of some of those ideas. So in between conferences, we'll be working with some of you and some of the participants on trying to make those ideas that you come in with happen, if they haven't happened yet. Of course, we cannot support all ideas, and there's limited resources, but the spirit is to incubate some of those ideas and see them go out into the world. And importantly, emotionally, and I go back full circle to the beginning of my talk, from an emotional and a personal point of view. This is a very deliberate attempt at instilling hope in human rights and global justice practice against the background of despair or hopelessness of this certain message that many practitioners and scholars are getting these days from many quarters. But this is not hope of the easy type. It requires a lot of hard work, and the best commentary on hope that I've ever encountered is a book that some of you may know by Rebecca Solnit, a well-known feminist author and activist, who published a beautiful book called Hope in the Dark. And she more recently published a collaborative volume, very much in the spirit of evolving from a single author to an author in a collective of diverse people from around the world. That book came out this year, called Not Too Late, which is about the climate crisis and responses to the climate crisis. And she ends one of the essays with this quote: "Hope is not optimism. Optimism assumes the best and assumes its inevitability, which leads to passivity, as do the pessimism and cynicism that assumes the worst. To hope is to recognize that you can protect some of what you love, even while grieving what you cannot, and to know that we must act without knowing the outcome of those actions."